The only conclusion I can come to is this is why bills are not supposed to become law like this. This is why hearings are supposed to happen. This is why experts, lawyers, are supposed to read these bills and amendments ahead of time and testify in public to tell us what their real-world effects would be. Because reading this law myself, I don't know. And clearly members of Congress are confused too. So it looks to me like they are just legislating out of their asses. And we're just going to have to live the effects to find them out.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 291st episode of the listener-supported Congressional Dish Podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. I have been reading bills and laws for you since 2012, and this is one of those moments where I feel like that was necessary, because over the course of this last year, I have been warning you about a bunch of different bills, and for some reason, Congress decided that this weekend, they were going to take a bunch of them and rush them into law. And so this past weekend, which was 420 weekend, for those of you who celebrate, happy birthday to weed. But over the course of 420 weekend, the House of Representatives decided to work on a weekend and pass a literal stack of at least 15 bills, with some key ones in that stack being the war money bill that we talked about a few episodes ago, the Not a TikTok ban, and the Repo Act, which will steal money that Russia has in the US-based financial system and give it to Ukrainians. Now, I don't know if the text of the bills that was passed this weekend and is on its way to law, I don't know if that's going to be the same exact text of the bills that I read for those episodes we've already done. Those were warning episodes. So I don't know if it's going to be exactly the same. But if you listen to those episodes, or if you have already, and they're all listed for you in this episode's show notes if you want to go back. But if you listen to them, you're going to have the general gist of what they're trying to do. But more importantly, you're going to hear the backstories and debates and hearings about whether or not passing these bills are wise ideas. Because in most cases, I was warning you about the bills because passing them into law would be, let's just say, problematic. And as I record this episode, the Senate is working in its slow Senate way on probably approving them. But as of this moment, I don't know how this is all going to shake out. There is still, chaos that can happen. And so I don't want to tell you something is law when it is not. And so once all of these bills are final and signed, then I will reread them and produce an episode letting you know what the differences are compared to the episodes I've already done, if there are any. And also, I promised you an episode about Palestine, but one of the 15 bills that passed through the House and is making its way through the Senate right now is a bill that gives reportedly $26 billion to Israel, which is definitely more than the original plan. So I know that one's different at least. And so I'm going to wait to produce the Palestine episode until I see what they do in that bill, because there's probably stuff in there that's either for Palestinians or stuff being done to the Palestinians, depending on how you look at it. But I will produce that episode with all of those changes that have become law in regards to Palestine since the end of December, because that'll be the National Defense Authorization Act, the funding laws, and then whatever Congress decided to do over 420 weekend. But there is one part of this unexpected congressional workathon that is already law, and that is the reauthorization of and changes to the FISA 702 warrantless spying program, which had to be reauthorized by the end of the day on April 19th. We think. We think that was the deadline. But today, since that is law, I'm going to tell you what those changes are and play for you some of the highlights and lowlights of the debate about those changes, which became law literally within minutes of the extension deadline. Although I kind of keep alluding to this, but it's possible that that deadline wasn't real. It's possible that even though there was a deadline in the law, that there had been some kind of administrative thing done to extend that. So I don't really know the backstory, but I also didn't research it because the bill became law, so who gives a shit? They were operating on a deadline, whether it was real or not. So that is one of the reasons why this went so fast, why the debate was so short. There was a deadline. How important it was doesn't really matter. And so we're just going to leave it at that. But basically, the program that was just reauthorized, the FISA 702 program, allows the government to spy on foreigners without warrants, which is fine because foreigners are not granted Fourth Amendment rights to privacy that are granted to Americans in our Constitution. However, the FISA 702 program collects information about Americans too, when Americans are communicating with foreign targets. And that information gets stored and sometimes searched without the government, the FBI in particular, first getting a warrant. And so that's why this program, FISA 702, is such a controversy every time it comes up for renewal. But it's also because FISA 702, this is a program that was born a controversy. It has been a scandal since before it was even a thing because it was born out of an illegal spying program created by and lied about by the rogue George W. Bush administration. At the end of 2005, we found out that right after 9/11 in 2002, President W. secretly and illegally authorized the National Security Agency to eavesdrop on foreigners and Americans without first getting a warrant. Now, at the time in 2005, the National Security Agency said that they are very careful and we only spy on Americans in limited circumstances. We're really only looking at foreigners and we only collect and search Americans' digital information in the cause of looking for the terrorists. And so we should just trust the NSA. They got this. But it wasn't long after that when we found out that they were lying and that the NSA was actually collecting the digital information of literally everyone without a warrant. And one of the ways that we know this is thanks to an AT&T technician turned whistleblower named Mark Klein, who worked at an AT&T facility on Folsom Street in San Francisco, California. And so here are some highlights of an interview he gave on C-SPAN's Washington Journal on November 8th, 2007.
I was a communications technician for 22 years. A lot of my job, particularly in the last few years, was to keep the network up. And I was one of the technicians that they'd call for if there was a problem, trouble, or an emergency. And I would change equipment, check lines, communications lines. That was basically my job. So one day we were told an agent from the NSA was coming to interview a management-level technician for a secret job, which we didn't know what it was for. But after a few weeks and months, we learned he was working on a secret facility that was installed at the Folsom Street office, which I arrived at that office about a year later. So by the time I arrived there, I already knew there was something secret going on.
And what did you come to learn about that program?
Well, I was assigned to the Internet room, so I was on top of the equipment. And one of the central pieces of equipment there was what they call a splitter. And the major Internet cables that carry everybody's Internet traffic, phone conversations, email, were run through this splitter. And what all the splitter does is make a copy of the entire data stream. It does not select anything in particular. It makes a copy, and that copy is sent down to the secret room. That's what the engineering documents show. They've installed permanent installations to collect people's communications forever. One assumes they store this stuff. And if they just wanted to look at international communications, these facilities are in the wrong place. Like downtown San Francisco is not the place you'd put a facility like this if you just wanted international communications. You'd put it closer to the border where the cables come in from the ocean.
And we found out after that these splitters were put all over the country. It wasn't just in San Francisco. And so this was part of a total information awareness program. George W. Bush administration wanted to collect and store it all. Now, Mark Klein was a witness in a lawsuit that was against AT&T and other telecom companies that participated in the illegal spying program. But in 2008, as the term-limited George W. Bush administration was on its way out the door, Congress passed and W. signed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Amendments Act of 2008, which gave immunity to the companies that said "F the Fourth Amendment" and cooperated with W. Bush's illegal spying program. And the 2008 law also created the FISA 702 program, which is the program that 16 years later just got reauthorized over 420 weekend. Now, FISA 702 is just one of the FISA spying programs, but it's not permanently authorized like some of the others, which means that Congress needs to debate it and reauthorize it from time to time, which they do because it's always been controversial. The FISA 702 program is essentially the warrantless spying program that the W. Bush administration pretended they were operating when they lied to the New York Times journalists in 2005. The kind of spying program that targets foreign people and only sweeps up Americans' information incidentally. As controversial as the FISA 702 program has always been, the truth is that it was created to rein in, to stop the government from collecting and storing literally all of the world's digital information. And over the years, the FISA 702 program has changed several times. So in the beginning of the program, the NSA was getting its information directly from internet service providers, like Mark Klein described, and storing the data in giant storage centers, the most famous of which was an NSA data center in the middle of nowhere in Utah that was so large that it cost about $2 billion of our tax money to build. But during the Obama-Biden administration, a few things happened that triggered massive public outrage and led to Congress being pressured into changing our country's spying laws. First, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which is the often rubber stamp court that operates mostly in secret and provides oversight and secret warrants when they're asked for. Well, that court, so not one that's really known for being all that tough on these programs, well, even that court had to admit in 2011 that aspects of the FISA 702 program, specifically the storage of Americans' information for 5 years and the lack of a system that separated Americans' data from foreigners' data, they said that was unconstitutional. And then, 2 years later in 2013, an American hero named Edward Snowden, who was working at Booz Allen Hamilton, a private sector company that was partnered with the NSA in their spying operations, well, Edward Snowden showed the world classified documents which proved that the U.S. government had direct access to the information being collected by the largest tech companies in the world. And that access allowed the government to collect our information and search through it without our knowledge and without a specific warrant. The outrage after the Snowden documents became public led to the USA Freedom Act, which I read and summarized for you back in 2015 in episode number 98 of Congressional Dish. Also, in the show notes for you. But that law essentially privatized the storage of our data. Since the USA Freedom Act became law, instead of the government collecting and storing our information out in the desert somewhere, private companies, their accomplices, have been holding onto our information and handing it over to the government on demand, being given legal immunity and in some cases money for doing so. But they also put some important limits on how the data can be requested and collected. So for example, the USA Freedom Act made it illegal for government snoops to request all data held by the whole company, or to request all the data in a whole city or even a state, which is the kind of broad requests that the W. Bush and Obama-Biden administration snoops were making before the USA Freedom Act became law. And so bit by bit, over time, since the George W. Bush administration attempted total information awareness by wiretapping the entire world, the FISA authorizations have been tweaked and often reined in an attempt to find a way to spy on us, but to do so in a way that doesn't so obviously violate the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. And over this past weekend, Congress did it again. And this reauthorization is really a mixed bag. In some ways, Congress put restraints on the FISA 702 program, which I'm not really hearing much about. What I am hearing a lot about, though, is that in other ways, they expanded it. And so today we're going to take a look at the details of the changes made and the arguments for why the members of Congress say they did what they did. And what's great about the way they did this is that there were some votes taken this weekend that you can definitely use to find out how well your representative is representing you, because there were some single issue votes that you can look at when you decide how to vote in November. So, to get into the details of the changes that were made, I think we need to really understand what the problem is with the FISA 702 program. And Representative Jerry Nadler of New York, the top-ranking Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, explained it really well during the House floor debate on April 12th.
Some of my colleagues appear confused about how Section 702 collection works and what we mean when supporters of a warrant requirement refer to backdoor searches for U.S. personal information. So let's be clear about what we're talking about. FISA Section 702 permits the intelligence community to sweep up the communication of foreign targets located overseas. When these communications are obtained, they go into what is known as the 702 database, where all the 702 data is housed. If the U.S. government wants to target a U.S. person for foreign surveillance, U.S. person meaning an American or a legal permanent resident, they already can. They do this by getting a warrant under Title I of FISA, a separate and distinct part of FISA from Section 702. The government cannot target Americans under 702 because 702 does not protect the constitutional rights of the targets of the surveillance. Foreigners not located on U.S. soil do not have constitutional rights, so this is not a problem. What is a problem, however, is that massive amounts of Americans' communications are still swept up in 702 searches. If a U.S. person communicates with a foreign target, that American's communications with the target end up in the 702 database too. While we do not know precise numbers, we know that a vast amount of Americans' communications is swept up every year. The intelligence community is not supposed to search the 702 database for U.S. person identifiers like our names, phone numbers, and addresses without cause. Searching for Americans' private communications in the 702 database, communications the government otherwise would not have access to without a warrant, is the constitutional equivalent of conducting a warrantless search. But we know that the government breaks this law all the time. 278,000 times, in fact, at last count in 2021 alone. Officials are supposed to find it reasonably likely that a query will turn up evidence of a crime or foreign intelligence information. But that did not stop them from searching for protesters, politicians, and political donors, to name a few, without proper predicate.
So the problem agency that has broken the law at least 278,000 times is the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. Now, the FBI is only supposed to use that database that stores the information of Americans that's been incidentally picked up on wiretaps of foreigners if the FBI search is, quoting from the law, quote, reasonably likely to return foreign intelligence information or evidence of a crime, unquote. And the FBI abused the evidence of a crime part of that sentence. The FBI was using the database to conduct searches related to domestic criminal investigations that had nothing to do with national security or any foreign person, company, or government. So, for example, and I'm pulling this straight from a partially declassified Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court report from April 2022, the FBI searched the database for information about homicide victims, their families, and witnesses simply because their connection to a victim made it reasonably likely that doing so could retrieve evidence of a crime. The FBI also searched the database for information about people arrested during protests, saying that simply because these people were arrested, it's likely they did some crime, and therefore searching the database for the information would likely retrieve evidence of a crime. And the FBI also searched the database for information about over 19,000 donors to a single congressional campaign, people who weren't arrested or even suspected of any crime. And so the FBI's excuse for that one is that they thought the campaign was a target for foreign influence. As if we don't have an entire lobbying organization, AIPAC, showering members of Congress with cash in return for passing laws that benefit a foreign country called Israel. And so obviously, suspecting that a foreign anything is interested in a campaign did not give the FBI the right to search the database for information about 19,000 innocent Americans. These were all simply FBI fishing expeditions. All of those searches had no connection to foreigners or national security at all, which made all of those searches illegal. And so, you abuse it, you lose it. And so as of this weekend, the FBI is no longer legally allowed to search the database solely to find evidence of a crime. And this is an important step in the right direction. The new law also limits the number of people within the FBI and the government in general that's allowed to use the database. And in terms of the FBI, it requires that an FBI supervisor or FBI lawyer grant approval for any searches of Americans' information in the foreign collection database. That's all good stuff. And on top of that, the new law also prevents the FBI from using uncorroborated information from political groups or anonymous sources in press reports to get FISA warrants, which I'm guessing was included, even though it really doesn't have to do anything with 702 in particular. But I'm guessing that was included because we know that FISA warrants were granted, allowing the government to spy on a member of the Trump campaign in 2016 based off of bullshit that was paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign. And so if we were to have this law in place at that time, they would have needed more evidence that they wouldn't have had, and maybe that FISA warrant wouldn't have been granted. And so that's the good news. That's how the new law places some much-needed restrictions on the FBI in particular, and how often and for what reasons they're allowed to use the database to search through our information that's collected simply because you communicate with someone outside of the United States. The rest of the law, however, it expands the government's power, although to what extent it is unclear. And so let's get into it. So first, the new law expands the definition of foreign intelligence to include counter-narcotics targets, which, fine. I don't think anyone cares if this is used to spy on drug cartels who aren't in the United States. But the law also expands the Department of Justice's ability to search the database to vet foreigners who are applying for visas just to travel to the United States. So they can use this authority to spy and to wiretap people who want to come here for tourism. Now, this was added to the new law by an amendment that was offered by Representative Mike Waltz, who's a Republican of Florida. And here's what he said about his amendment.
I rise today in support of my amendment to permit the use of 702 information to vet foreign nationals entering the United States. This amendment enables the thorough vetting of all foreigners being processed for travel into the United States, whether that's a foreign national applying for a visa, applying for legal immigration, or crossing illegally our southern border. This is what I think a lot of Americans probably don't realize. Currently, Section 702 has only been authorized to collect information to support some Department of Homeland Security efforts to screen and vet foreign persons applying for travel or immigration to the United States. This amendment will enhance the vetting of all foreigners who come here.
Which might seem, or I don't know, even be reasonable on its face. But here's how this expansion of 702 permissions will affect you and I in real life. Here's Representative Pramila Jayapal, a Democrat of Washington, followed by Representative Jim Jordan, a Republican of Ohio.
People seeking to come to this country are not monolithic communities cut off from Americans. Many of them are close family members of U.S. citizens seeking reunification through family sponsorship or just a simple visit. Many others are sponsored by U.S. employers.
But this is going to sweep up so many more Americans where the FBI 278,000 times not illegally, but didn't follow their own rules when they queried the database. But now they got even more. Holy cow, this is the wrong way to go.
And that makes sense to me. If you expand the number of wiretaps of foreigners, you are going to expand the number of Americans who are going to have our information collected because we are communicating with these new targets. And Jim Jordan had this final thought about this provision, which did make it into law after the amendment passed 227 to 193, where the majority of Republicans said yes and the majority of Democrats said no.
I would just close our time by saying, Mr. Chair, every time you expand FISA, you underscore the need for a warrant. The bigger and bigger this database gets, the more U.S. persons are going to be searched. You underscore the need for a warrant, which we've spent the whole morning debating.
Which is true. All of it. Including the fact that the majority of the debate on the bill was about whether or not Congress would pass an amendment offered by Representative Andy Biggs that would require the FBI and other government agencies to get warrants before they're allowed to search through the database of information that they wouldn't otherwise have if it weren't for the wiretaps of foreigners. The person who, in my opinion, made the most eloquent argument for a warrant is a member of Congress who, While I don't always agree with her, I have always found her to be a serious lawmaker whose words about bills I tend to at least listen to. This is Representative Zoe Lofgren of California.
Now, under the amendment being offered, a warrant would be required for a search of the data of U.S. persons. This is important. It would exclude imminent threats, exigent circumstances, as any warrant requirement does, or it would exclude cases where a person consents to a search or where there is cybersecurity. It excludes metadata. It's important to note that the FBI executed more than 200,000 warrantless searches of U.S. persons in 2022, including 141 Black Lives Matter protesters, 2 members of Congress, journalists, commentators, political parties, donors to political campaigns. It's really outrageous. The base bill is insufficient to protect us. There's 2 major points that it makes. Neither makes any sense or any difference. The big deal is a prohibition on U.S. person queries that are conducted solely for the evidence of a crime. That sounds good until you realize that the FBI almost never does that. In fact, in 2022, there were only 2 cases in which that provision would have been a prohibition. And the second issue is codifying the regulations about searches by the FBI today. Obviously, that doesn't do any good because the FBI, under the current regulations, continues to violate our rights and to do warrantless searches. The only way to end the abuse is to approve the warrant requirement that is being offered in the amendment. The American public agrees with us. 76% of Americans support requiring the government to get a warrant before searching in these cases.
And I will say that I consider myself a part of that 76%. As were both of my co-hosts on We're Not Wrong, Justin Robert Young and Andrew Heaton. And while I know that this is anecdotal, for the first time in the 2 years that we have been producing that debate show, we didn't get a single email disagreeing with us on our get a warrant take on the FISA amendments. Not one email. And so I tend to believe from my own experience talking about this over the internet to thousands of people with no one arguing back at me, that there is in fact a lot of support among us peasants for the idea that the cops should have to get a warrant before they snoop through information that was collected about us essentially by accident. And it appears that members of Congress are concerned about their own information being searched through by the snoops. Here's Representative Thomas Massie, a Republican of Kentucky.
There are people who say, oh, this bill is fine as is, doesn't need any amendments. But here's the problem with that. If we believed that, why would we put exemptions for Congress in this bill? There are exemptions for Congress in the base bill of 702. What do they do? They say that if a congressman is going to have their privacy violated with the 702 program by the FBI has to notify Congress. It goes on to say in this bill that if the FBI is going to tell us that they're doing it for our own good, they have to get permission from the congressman whose privacy is going to be violated. Why does that only apply to members of this body?
That's a damn good question. Why would innocent members of Congress make sure that they are given notification or to have to give their permission to have their information searched if there's nothing for the rest of us to worry about? And I say innocent because there is a clause in here that I have nicknamed the Menendez Clause that allows the FBI director to waive this requirement to inform members of Congress that they're targets of database searches if the notification would impede an ongoing national security or law enforcement investigation, such as the investigation into current sitting Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, who is currently under indictment and will soon be going to trial because it sure does look like he took bribes, which included fat wads of cash and gold bars in return for doing favors for the government of Egypt. In other words, he's credibly suspected of being a foreign agent for Egypt, and he's still a senator! And so if you haven't heard it yet, you need to listen to the Menendez half of Congressional Dish 285. We called that the Indicteds, which gives you all of the juicy details of that story. Now, the other half of the episode was about former Representative George Santos, but he's already been expelled from Congress for far less serious offenses. But the overall point is, going back to the new FISA reauthorization, that the FBI would still have the ability to search the database for a member of Congress's information without their knowledge, if the member of Congress is a corrupt piece of shit like Bob Menendez and is the target of an investigation. But outside of a Bob and Bubbles situation like that one, members of Congress now have protections against warrantless searches that the rest of us don't have. And so I'm with Thomas Massey on this one. That's fucked up. Also fucked up was the circular logic employed by the members of Congress who not only gave themselves special protection, but then made arguments like this for why we shouldn't be protected from warrantless searches of the database that we're only incidentally included in. Here's Representative Jim Himes, a Democrat of Connecticut.
The Biggs Amendment would require a warrant for every single U.S. person query that the government makes inside information that it already has. The narrow exceptions including in this amendment will also not work. You don't need to take that from me. Talk to anybody in the government who uses this program. We don't know if a query is about something that is an exigency until we know what is in the information that query would turn up.
We don't know what information we'll find until we look for it, which is exactly the problem. We peasants are concerned that the FBI has been going on fishing expeditions, just looking through the database without reason to suspect us of anything, just to see what they find. And instead of saying, well, they aren't doing that, this member of Congress is concerned that requiring a warrant would force them to stop. I mean, talk about saying the quiet part out loud. And it seemed pretty clear that Jim Himes and others like him weren't forming their opinions on this based on the feedback from their constituents, from us peasant voters who gave them their jobs. I mean, you heard it right there. Talk to anyone in the government who uses this program. Now, it seems to me like Jim Himes and friends were serving as mouthpieces for the government snoops who have the power to sift through our information without warrants and want to keep that power. And this particular administration, the Biden administration, seems to have scared their little sheep into submission. If you are unfamiliar, you're going to hear a name, Jake Sullivan. Jake Sullivan is President Biden's national security advisor. Here's Jim Himes again.
As Jake Sullivan said this week, quote, "The extensive harm of this proposal simply cannot be mitigated." I would point my colleagues, particularly on my side of the aisle, to the President's extraordinarily strong statement of administrative policy in which he reiterates the damage that will be done by this amendment should it pass. And my friends, a lot of what we do here, the consequences don't appear immediately. If we turn off the ability of the government to query U.S. person data, the consequences will be known soon. And we will audit why what happened, and the consequences will be known soon, and accountability will be visited.
Be afraid, be afraid, which was a theme continued by Republican Representative Mike Turner of Ohio.
If this amendment passes, al-Qaeda will have full constitutional protections to recruit in the United States. The Communist Party will have full constitutional protection to recruit in the United States. And there will be no increased protection of constitutional protections for Americans and their data. The only data that would become protected is data that's located in al-Qaeda's inbox and the Communist Chinese inbox. Now, how is that they become protected? This amendment would require that you have to have a warrant to look into Communist Chinese Party data for the recruitment efforts that they are doing within the United States. You would have to have evidence of a crime that is occurring in order to be able to get that warrant, which means we'll be blind.
Every single sentence that he just said is bullshit. Because all communications from foreigners are fair games with no warrants required. And nothing about this amendment would change that. All communications from the CCP to an American for any purpose is likely to retrieve foreign intelligence information and therefore would be allowed to be searched. Same with Al-Qaeda, which at this point, is Al-Qaeda even a thing anymore? And then Mike Turner went on to give an example that was so wrong and so stupid that I feel compelled to share.
Let me give you an example of how this works under their amendment. We're spying on Hamas. Two people in the United States send emails to Hamas. One says, "Happy birthday," and one says, "Thank you for the bomb-making classes." Now, when those two emails go to Hamas, right now we see them. If you send a happy birthday to Hamas and we see it, that doesn't matter. It's not a threat to the United States. You send an email that says, "Thank you for the bomb-making classes." We intercept that email. We read it, we find out who it is, and then when we come here to go find that person, to arrest them, to make certain that they don't harm Americans, we have to go to court and get a warrant. There already is a warrant requirement for the protection of Americans and people who are here in the United States. If you have to have a warrant to look at the two emails that are sent to Hamas, "Happy birthday," and "Thank you for the bomb-making classes," you have no evidence of a crime. You have no ability to read these two emails. We will go dark. We will go blind.
Well, I read the amendment. That is total crap, because it in no way would have given Fourth Amendment protection to Hamas or Hezbollah or the CCP or any other foreign person, company, party, government, anything foreign. They can all be legally spied upon with no warrant, even if the warrant amendment passed. This was straight up not true. And to his credit, Jerry Nadler, the Democrat of New York and ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, called Turner out on his bullshit.
Now, Chairman Turner stated incorrectly that the proposed warrant requirement gives constitutional rights to suspected terrorists abroad. Nonsense. The warrant requirement does not change any aspect of surveillance of valid targets under Section 702, nor should it. The problem is that when we surveil the Internet, we sweep up massive amounts of U.S. person information. And the warrant requirement we propose would apply the Fourth Amendment to that information, nothing more, and our Constitution demands nothing less. We have repeatedly heard some of our colleagues tell us that the sky is falling, that a probable cause requirement would end U.S. person searches of the 702 database. But there are no facts to back up these claims.
But factless as those claims were, they were repeated and were apparently convincing to exactly half of the House of Representatives, because the amendment that would have required warrants, except in emergencies, to search through our incidentally collected digital information, it was voted on, and the vote tied. But in order for an amendment to get into a bill, it has to get a majority. And so that tie is a fail. The warrant amendment failed. But that vote is one that you can use to judge your representative in the House. It was a single issue vote that couldn't be clearer. Should the government be able to spy on you without a warrant? You decide the answer to that question, and then you can use this vote to see if your representative voted accordingly. So again, this was the Biggs Amendment, and I have, of course, included it in the show notes for you. But I also know you may not remember this come November, and so I am creating a list of votes like this one that can be used to judge our representatives and senators on important issues. And I'm going to produce an episode with all of them, which I'm planning to release in October. So I will remind you of this before you vote. But that's a small glimmer of good news here. The vote was so close, closer than it's ever been in the history of FISA 702. And we can use this vote, because it was a single issue vote, to fire the people who are not representing us well in these important moments. And then, on top of that, there is one more amendment that I need to tell you about. It was the most controversial one that unfortunately passed, and it was offered by two people that you are already familiar with. Representative Mike Turner, the Republican of Ohio, and Representative Jim Himes, the Democrat of Connecticut, the guys who you just heard argue against requiring warrants. And Mike Turner in particular. You know, I've been watching Congress for a long time, and I've got to tell you, I'm not that familiar with Mike Turner. I know that his background before coming to Congress in 2002, so 22 years ago, was that he was the former mayor of Dayton, Ohio, which is a resume that doesn't really require him to know anything. But he's been in Congress since 2002, which means that he was there for most of the original FISA debates during the George W. Bush administration. He was there when Edward Snowden showed us how comprehensive the spying apparatus between government and tech companies actually was. He was there when the USA Freedom Act made changes based on what Snowden showed us. And so I don't understand how, after being in Congress for that long, that he could be so wildly wrong about everything he said about the FISA 702 program and how it works. Now, I don't know if he actually understands the law and this bill and was purposefully fear-mongering, or if he's a complete idiot and has no idea what he's talking about. But he's concerning to me because he is currently the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. And it makes me wonder if he is not actually doing oversight of the spooks, but instead is serving as a spook, doing whatever they tell him to do in Congress, because he wouldn't be the first. But either way, I wanted to show you how shockingly wrong Mike Turner was during the warrant amendment debate, because he is the author of the amendment that generated all the reasonable controversy about this bill in the Twitterverse as it was on its way to becoming law. And that's the amendment, the Turner-Himes Amendment, that expands the definition of electronic communications service provider. Now, previously, as you know, the government was going to companies that had direct access to the communication systems. AT&T, Google, Facebook, AOL, Skype, Apple. These were electronic communications service providers. And as classified as such, they, in multiple laws, were given immunity for their participation in the past and in the future for cooperating with the government in spying on us. Well, this new law expands the companies that would get immunity for turning our information over to the government to include, quote, any other service provider who has access to equipment that is being or may be used to transmit or store wire or electronic communications, unquote. Anyone with access to the equipment. Anyone that has access to communications equipment, so Wi-Fi routers or cables that are buried outside your building. I mean, there's so many technicians that have access to that type of equipment. It reads as pretty broad. Although I do have to mention that there were some exceptions written into law. So these are the types of companies that would not get immunity and therefore be compelled to give our information to the government. And those exceptions are a public accommodation facility, a dwelling, a community facility, or a food service establishment. So, knowing that, here's Representative Michael Turner, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee again, who's either a liar or an idiot, explaining to the House of Representatives why he wanted this change added to the new FISA reauthorization. And in case you don't know, a SCIF is a secure room where members of Congress go to receive classified information.
There is a SCIF off of the House floor to provide additional information to members that I'm not able to present here. This amendment is to correct a technical issue that was found by the FISA court with respect to critical intelligence and a technological issue in which there was a gap.
And that was it. Then the amendment passed with really no debate. The debate for the whole bill was almost entirely on the warrant amendment. This amendment was the last one and was hardly discussed at all. But that was not the case on the internet or a few days later in the Senate when Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon tried to get this amendment removed from the bill. Now, Senator Ron Wyden has been one of the loudest voices arguing for our privacy rights since the George W. Bush administration. And so when Ron Wyden talks about this stuff, I listen. And so here are some highlights of what he said about this amendment on the Senate floor on April 19th, just a few hours before the vote.
I rise this morning to discuss what happened at the end of the debate in the House of Representatives on Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And particularly, I'm going to be talking about the sweeping new authorities that were slipped into the legislation at that time by the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Now, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee called this amendment, expanding all these surveillance authorities, he called it merely technical. I want to explain why it's not just technical and how it passed the House with virtually no debate. Under the provision, there would be virtually no limits to who can be forced into spying for the government. any company that installs, maintains, or repairs Wi-Fi or other communication systems in any American business or home, for example, can be dragged into this. So can any other company that provides a service that gives its employees access to any communications equipment, which would include a server, a wire, a cable box, a Wi-Fi router, a phone, or a computer. Lots of examples here, Mr. President. Every office building in America has data cables running through it. Tens of thousands of commercial establishments offer Wi-Fi to their customers. Under this provision, landlords, the companies that maintain the cables and Wi-Fi, and any number of companies whose employees have access to any of that equipment can all be forced to cooperate with the government's surveillance. Now, supporters of this provision spend a lot of time pointing to the exceptions. But the handful of narrow exceptions, Mr. President, makes my point. It proves my point. If you're not on that short list, in effect, it's an admission you can be forced to spy for the government. And the exceptions are clearly designed so as not to restrain the vast new authorities in any meaningful way. They're not even designed to work. For example, the exceptions do not include commercial landlords or any company that installs, maintains, or repairs Wi-Fi or communications cables. So even if the government can't force a coffee shop to comply, it can force its landlord or the company that maintains the coffee shop's Wi-Fi to comply. The provision does not change the targeting rules, but it dramatically changes who can be forced to actually help the government. And you don't have to change the targeting rules to threaten Americans' privacy. If the government thinks that its foreign targets are communicating with people in the United States, they can go right to the source. The Wi-Fi, the phone lines, the servers that transmit or store those communications. In my view, Mr. President, that is a stunning example of the government's ability to collect American communications and no changes in targeting authority. Now, all of a sudden, the Senate is being asked to dramatically expand the authorities of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in a way that is almost guaranteed to result in abuses. And my own view is that it is shocking that with no publication, no hearings, no processing of a piece of legislation in a single week to think about it, that the Senate is being asked to give the government sweeping new authorities that could fundamentally change the relationship in this country between Americans and their government. If the Senate passes this legislation today, my own view is, Mr. President, the senators are going to regret it. And when the eventual wave of abuses is exposed, nobody is going to be able to say now, given the fact we're airing specific responses to what the government said in the attempt to justify it. Nobody is now going to be able to say they didn't see it coming. There are a number of us on both sides of the aisle who are pursuing an amendment to strike this dangerous provision. I'm pushing very hard to remove this provision.
But he failed. The senators voted 34 to 58 to keep that amendment. And then the Senate voted at 11:45 p.m. on Friday night to pass the bill 60 to 34, and President Biden immediately signed it into law. Now, after hearing Wyden speak about the Himes-Turner Amendment, I was worried. I was worried enough to produce this episode. But then I read the new law, and I looked at the list of exceptions. There were only 4, but I looked at them very closely because each one of them had a link basically to other definitions. I tell you all the time that when you read a bill, what's hard about it is that it makes you jump into current law. You have to go back and forth. And so there were the exceptions, but they had their own definitions. And I had to jump into current law to read those definitions. And after doing that, I don't think it's as broad as it seems upon first glance. Because while there were only 4 kinds of locations that are exempt from the new definition of electronic communication service provider, and therefore whose employees would not be authorized or required to turn our information over to the government, the definitions of those categories are pretty broad themselves. And so let's look at them one by one. The biggest exception, the big group of businesses whose employees would not be required to turn over information, is a public accommodation facility, which is a term that I can say I've never heard before. But when you look at the definition of that, it is businesses that are generally open to the public. That's pretty broad. And the examples in current law include restaurants, movie theaters, schools, daycare facilities, recreational facilities, doctor's offices, factories, warehouses, office buildings. And that was a red flag for me because Ron Wyden specifically mentioned office buildings as a category that he was worried about. But they are clearly excluded in the definition of a public accommodation facility, which makes me question how close Ron Wyden and his staff looked at this. Did they look at the definition of public accommodation facility? Because if they did, how could they possibly think that office buildings would have to turn over information to the government? And just the definition, public accommodation facility being anywhere that's open to the public, that excludes most places that we would go. And then there's the second exception, which is a dwelling. And when you look at the definition of that, that is any building which is intended as a residence by one or more families. And so landlords are exempt from having to cooperate with government surveillance, another clear category that Wyden named that he was concerned about. Then another exception is a community facility, which includes sewers and garbage disposal facilities, police and fire protection facilities, water purification facilities, libraries, hospitals. And then the last one is a food service establishment, and that one is super broad as well. It includes anywhere that serves food, restaurants, bars, cafeterias, food stands, any facility that serves food to the public. So, looking at the detailed list of exemptions, I'm actually wondering what was added by the expansion. Like, what are the new companies that are allowed or required to turn over information to the government? And so I'm standing here now, I have so many questions, but unfortunately, I can't get them answered because you heard the author. He was basically like, well, unless you can come with me to the skiff, I can't tell you shit. And then Ron Wyden, just my comparison of his words to what I saw in the law, those didn't explain much either. They didn't match. And we don't know the backstory about what the government was trying to get and couldn't because the court said that the business is not an electronic communication service provider. Like, what business was it that they couldn't get the information from? We don't know because we're not in the skiff. And so on one hand, Mike Turner was dead wrong about the warrant amendment on very basic information. And he might be an idiot. And he wrote this amendment about the definition of the electronic service providers. And so it might be sloppy and broad and expansive as Ron Wyden is concerned that it is. But on the other hand, Ron Wyden was listing businesses that are clearly exempt if you bother to look at the definitions of the exempted categories. And so Ron Wyden appears to be full of shit too. And so I don't know who to believe. And the only conclusion I can come to is this is why bills are not supposed to become law like this. This is why hearings are supposed to happen. This is why experts, lawyers, are supposed to read these bills and amendments ahead of time and testify in public to tell us what their real-world effects would be. Because reading this law myself, I don't know. And clearly members of Congress are confused too. So it looks to me like they are just legislating out of their asses. And we're just going to have to live the effects to find them out. Now, the good news about this is that we're not going to have to live them too long before Congress will be forced to reevaluate FISA 702's permissions again. Because instead of this reauthorization being for the usual 5 years, this reauthorization will only be for 2 years. And so, like I said, this new law is a mixed bag. You know, I'm happy that the FBI's fishing expeditions have been limited. I'm happy that the warrant amendment, while it didn't pass, was so close that it tied. That means it has a real chance of passing when this reauthorization happens all over again in just 2 years, especially if we take our opportunity in November to fire the people like Mike Turner and Jim Himes who sided with the government snoops instead of us. But there is a chance that the Turner-Himes amendment expanded the number of companies that can be forced to hand over our information. To really analyze that provision, I would have to think through every business that exists and see if it fits into those exemptions. And while I don't think that the situation is nearly as dire as Ron Wyden said it is, because the text of our laws clearly says that it's not, I don't have the expertise needed to see the loopholes, and the experts weren't consulted during this rushed process. And so once again, what we are witnessing is a process of creating laws that is shamefully broken. The norms in Congress, what the dinosaurs in Congress have turned into normal operating procedure over the course of my lifetime, they are all kinds of wrong, and they are leading to sloppy laws whose consequences can't be known because of the way they are doing their jobs. We need new people and new norms in Congress. It's long overdue. But as for how the changes to the FISA 702 spying and collection provisions affects you, the truth is, I feel like we lost our Fourth Amendment rights to privacy in the digital space a long time ago. If you have been operating, as I have, under the assumption that all of your digital data is being collected and stored and sold and stolen and snooped through, then these changes really won't matter to you. Keep assuming that, because you're probably right. And if you're wrong, okay, you're just being extra careful. What you can do about this is just protect yourself accordingly as if they've got it all. So if you're going to go buy weed and you don't want the government to know, use cash. You want to go visit someone and don't want it tracked? Leave your phone at home. Do you have a car that is connected to the Internet of Things? Walk. Take public transportation. You can hide from the digital spies in the old-fashioned ways. That's how you can protect yourself. And if you use digital anything, just know that the government can probably find the information and use it somehow. That's the only way to protect yourself from all this. Kind of have to give up, because I have. And because of that, I've seen a lot of bills become law that have made my blood boil. You've heard it on this show. But this just isn't one of them. Because when I zoom out, the spying situation, big picture, is certainly better than it was during the George W. Bush administration. They aren't using splitters anymore and storing the entire internet in the desert for years. And from the USA Freedom Act to this new law, there has been a slow but real trend in a better direction. The FBI is limited in ways now that it wasn't even a few years ago. Hell, a few days ago. And I do think that it is possible, if not probable, that warrants will be required for FISA 702 searches in the not-too-distant future because that vote was so close. And the arguments against requiring warrants were so fear-mongery and dumb. And this will be revisited again in just 2 years. And so between my assumptions that they're collecting all my data, even when I know they probably aren't, but between that and my hope that the trend away from the George W. Bush administration dream of total information awareness will continue, I'm not feeling all that bad about this FISA thing. Not compared to how other issues in the world are making me feel right now. And so my advice to you is to use encrypted apps to send your most fucked up jokes to your friends and assume the government has access to everything you do online and go on with your life. Because there are more important issues to focus on right now. Okay, so I have an update for you. It's not one that I'm all that thrilled about, but it is also not all that surprising. When I started recording this episode, I told you that there was a package of bills. It was at least 15 bills. It included $95 billion in foreign wars. It included stealing Russia's money and giving it to Ukraine. It included the Not a TikTok ban bill. That package has now passed to the Senate, and as I'm recording this, I'm not sure if it's law yet, but it is on the president's desk. It's going to be signed today. So that's a done deal. I've already looked at the Not a TikTok ban bill to see if I have to redo that episode to see if there are any major changes made. There were not. There was one change that was made, and that had to do with the timing. So if you haven't listened to the Not a TikTok ban bill episode yet, essentially That bill doesn't ban TikTok. That's why I named the episode that. It doesn't ban TikTok. The targets are actually the companies that enable TikTok to be on your phone and on your computers. And so instead of punishing TikTok for doing whatever they're saying TikTok is doing that is wrong, what they're going to do is punish Apple and Google for providing TikTok in the Apple Store. And the fines are so high that Apple and Google would basically not be able to exist. And then they do the same for the internet hosting. Right now, it is Oracle that is doing the internet hosting for TikTok, and Oracle would be fined out of existence if they continue to host TikTok. That's how it works. It's actually American companies that are targets in regards to TikTok. But again, this isn't just about TikTok because it doesn't only target TikTok. It is any app or website, or they had another term, but I basically read it as AI. But any app or website that is more than 20% foreign owned can be deemed a problem by the president and be a target of this bill. So this is a massive expansion of presidential power. It is law now. And the only difference between what I told you about it in that episode and what became law is that the companies that are being forced to divest are going to have 9 months to do it instead of 6. And then the president will have the ability one time to extend their deadline by 90 days. But everything that matters, all the substance, that is all exactly the same. And so that episode, you can go ahead and listen to that and you will understand what just became law. As for the Repo Act, which is the one that steals Russia's money and gives it to Ukraine, when I did the episode about I called it Thieving Russia, that's a good one to listen to get the debate, but I don't know exactly which version of the different proposals became law, and so I will read that and let you know. And then, of course, there's $95 billion in war money, including money that has to do with the Israel-Gaza situation. So like I said, I will do a Palestine episode. And then I did a quick scan of the package, and there's a lot in there about Iran too, a bunch of sanctions. So my plan is I'm going to go run a quick half marathon in Nashville this weekend, and then I'll come back and I will get working on all that. But it's incredibly frustrating to me because this Congress has done nothing for the 1 year and 4 months that it has been in session. And it has done all of the legislating since the beginning of March. It has been 6 weeks where they funded the entire government for 2024. And then they just did this package that it was. So in the House, when it comes to like holding these people accountable, the House did it in 4 different chunks. So there was the money there was 3 different war money votes. So there was one on Israel, one on Ukraine, one on the rest of it. And then there was this like sloppy bill that had the rest of it. So like the Repo Act and the TikTok ban bill and all of the Iran sanctions, those were in one bill. And those were all voted on separately. So there were 4 votes in the House. But then they took all of those and they put it into one bill in order for it to get through the Senate. And like I've told you this before, a bill has to pass the House and Senate in identical form in order for it to become law, but they are allowed to squish them together like this. And so to hold your senators accountable, I don't know how to do that because they packaged money for a bunch of different wars for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, all the Iran sanctions, steal Russia's money, the TikTok thing. It's all in one bill. And so all of these people can say, well, I know I voted for the thing that you don't like, but there's this thing that we really needed in there. It's a way to completely avoid accountability. It's a terrible way to legislate. And it's also terrible that all of this happened in the course of a week. And I think the reason that they're doing this is, well, right now the House is on vacation again. So I don't know. I didn't get a week off for 420, but the House of Representatives apparently does. I don't understand the reason why. They just got back from their Easter vacation, which was 2 weeks long. So they're gone again. But I think it's time for them to start campaigning. I don't think that there's going to be a ton happening from here on forward. And so I do think I will have the time to really tear this apart and give you the stories that are in it. But I'm extremely frustrated. And I have a ton of work ahead of me because Claire and I were just getting started on the funding bill and the NDAA. We had only looked at the Israel part. We had kind of had eyes on a few different topics in there, but I have a mountain of legislation now that is law. So really needs to be looked at sitting on my desk. And so if you support what I'm doing, I do need to support you. I need you to support the show because even though I put out a call for funding in the last episode, it's not really coming in. We have no executive producers to announce on this episode. This is one of those days where I have a ton of work ahead of me and I'm just feeling very frustrated. So please support the show. You know, I don't understand the drop in funding. I'm assuming it's because of my information, which is all true, that I've told you about Israel. I don't know that, though. I don't know what it is. But the funding needs to pick up because we've been stagnant now for a year. In fact, we have fewer paid patrons now than we did a year ago. And I am very frustrated with that. Not going to lie. Very frustrated with that. I also know that I need to tell you that the tickets are now on sale for We're Not Wrong live in DC. That's going to be May 24th. That's a Friday at 7 p.m. at the Anacostia Arts Center. I did put the tickets in our Congressional Dish Patreon. So if you saw that, you got first dibs on them. But we are already halfway sold out. So if you want to see that show and meet me live in DC on May 24th, you need to get your tickets now. This is a don't wait situation. It is the venue, I didn't think that we needed a bigger venue than this, but maybe we do next time. But for this time, this is what we got. And once we hit capacity, there's nothing I can do. So go ahead and buy those tickets. And just so you know, we don't make any money on this. You're basically just paying the costs for us to rent the venue. But even these live shows, they're costing me money right now because we're trying to build a show. Yeah, I'm just very frustrated. I'm seeing a lot of money going out the door. I just had to pay my taxes. I'm not one of those people that has a classic job where they just automatically take it out of my paycheck. So I'm not aware of how much money I'm paying in taxes. Like, oh no, I'm aware of how much money I pay in taxes. 4 times a year, I take all of my Patreon money and send it straight to the government. And right now, I know that is going to foreign wars that I don't support. So I am frustrated. I am frustrated with doing this and having to focus on this so much in my life. Yeah, I'm frustrated. And this is one of those moments where I do need your support, and to ask for it last week in the way I did and to not get it. I'm frustrated. So please support the show. That's all I'm asking. Please support the show. And it doesn't have to be at the executive producer level. I think it's great how many people choose to be executive producers, but what we really need is everyone who listens to support the show at like $5 an episode on Patreon, or whatever amount works for you. You can set the amount. It doesn't have to be 5 or 10 or 40 or whatever I've set on there. You can adjust it. There are people that pay $1 per episode, and I thank you very much. This is a message to the people that are paying $0, and there are thousands and thousands of you that are paying $0. Please pay more than $0. That's all I'm asking. If we all are paying a little bit, then it adds up to this show being just fine. So, yep, that's what's going on. All right, so I want to thank Claire for your very quick work on getting these sound clips ready for this episode. We turned this around real fast with some very long work days. So thank you, Claire. Thank you, Mark. Mark, I forgot to thank in the last episode, but he is so essential to this podcast. He does our website security. So his company is podcastbranding.co to be exact, but he does our website security, our website design. He makes sure that I have the right hosting, which I didn't. Yeah, I don't know what I would do without Mark. And he's the one who designed that wonderful website. I certainly could not have done that myself. So thank you, Mark. And thank you, Pro Podcast Solutions, which has been editing this show for, I think, over a decade now. And thank you to Lauren, even though you didn't have much work this week because we didn't have many donations and we certainly didn't have any executive producers. My sister, she's the best, man. She's the one who keeps track of all the money that comes in so that my taxes aren't any more painful than they already are. So, yeah. And of course, thank you for listening. And if you are paying for the show, thank you for doing so. And if you're not, again, I need you. All right. I will talk to you as soon as I can. God, I have so much work ahead of me. But I'll talk to you soon. In the meantime, listen to We're Not Wrong. All right. Take care. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. With the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright. In the end, he'll justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny. deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.